The year was 1874, and the train was a serpent of iron and smoke, slicing through the vast, sleeping body of the New Mexico desert. Its rhythmic clatter was the only heartbeat in a world of silent, silvered sand and distant, skeletal mesas that clawed at a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars. The moon, a stark white coin, offered no warmth, only a spectral light that bleached the color from the landscape, rendering it in shades of bone and shadow. Inside the serpent's belly, lamps swayed with the rocking of the cars, casting a jaundiced, flickering glow on the faces of weary travelers. Most were asleep, heads lolling against the hard-backed seats, mouths agape, lost in dreams of destinations that promised more than this endless, rattling void. But in the last car, one soul was starkly, terrifyingly awake. Clara moved like a phantom, a whisper of torn calico and desperate fear. She was 18, though the terror etched onto her face made her look both younger and ancient. Her journey from the front of the train had been a pilgrimage of dread. Each car she passed through was a new circle of hell. In the first-class carriage, she'd seen men in fine coats with gold watch chains stretched across their vests, their gazes lingering on her with a predatory assessment that made her skin crawl. She'd hurried on, her bare feet sticking to the polished floor. In the passenger cars, families slept in tangled heaps, and lone prospectors snored, their dreams likely filled with gold and whiskey. A few men, awake and drunk, had watched her pass, their muttered comments greasy and unwelcome, forcing her to pull the tattered remnants of her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to a single, primal objective: the end of the train, the last car, a place to disappear. She stumbled through the final connecting door, her breath catching in her throat like a trapped bird. The air here was different, colder. It smelled of dust, worn leather, and the faint, metallic scent of loneliness. The car was almost empty, a hollow, echoing space used mostly for mail and excess freight. A few wooden crates were lashed against one wall. The windows were grimed with soot and sand, offering only distorted, fleeting glimpses of the moonlit emptiness outside. And in the far corner, a man sat alone. He was a silhouette against the grimy window, a study in stillness. He didn't seem to be a passenger in the same way the others were. They were traveling somewhere. He simply was. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, details emerged from the shadows. He wore a long, dusty duster, the color of the earth itself, draped over broad shoulders. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, obscuring his face in shadow. But she could see the hard line of a jaw covered in dark stubble. One hand rested on his knee, the fingers long and calloused. The other was out of sight. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the worn leather of the holster holding a heavy-looking Colt. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the desert slide by, his posture relaxed but radiating an unnerving alertness, like a wolf resting but not at peace. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the train. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to hide somewhere else. This man was not a gentle soul. He was carved from the same harsh, unforgiving landscape that stretched outside the window. There was a quiet violence in his stillness, a history of hardship in the set of his shoulders. He looked like the kind of man who solved problems with a gun at his hip, not with soft words. He was dangerous. But the men behind her were a different kind of dangerous. Theirs was a sneering, possessive cruelty, a suffocating ownership she had felt like a brand on her skin. She had seen their faces in the flickering lamplight of the station platform as she'd scrambled aboard, their shouts swallowed by the hiss of steam. They were not lawmen. They were his men, her supposed husband's men, the man her father had called a good match, a man whose wealth was built on the misery sold in his saloon, and whose touch felt like spiders crawling on her skin. The fear of this stranger in the corner was a sharp, clean fear, like a knife's edge. The fear of the men hunting her was a filthy, creeping thing, a rot that threatened to consume her whole. She chose the knife's edge. Taking a shallow, trembling breath, she forced her feet to move. The floorboards creaked under her weight, the sound deafening in the relative quiet of the car. The man didn't move, but she felt his attention shift from the window to her. It wasn't a turn of the head. It was a subtle tightening of the air around him, a change in the quality of the silence. He knew she was there. He had known from the moment she'd opened the door. She stopped a few feet from him, a small, desperate creature caught in the unblinking gaze of a predator. She could see his eyes now, under the brim of his hat. They were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and held a cold, profound emptiness. They weren't cruel, not exactly. They were worse. They were devoid of expectation, of judgment, of anything that might offer her purchase. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little for a long, long time. His face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, creased by sun and wind. He might have been 30 or 50. It was impossible to tell. Words failed her. Her throat was a desert, her tongue a stone. She could feel the seconds stretching, feel the train carrying her further from one danger and possibly closer to another. She had to speak. She had to try. She swallowed, the sound painfully loud. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw, broken whisper, barely audible above the train's clamor. "Please." He didn't respond. His gray eyes stayed on her, steady and unreadable. He wasn't offering help, but he wasn't turning her away. Either, he was simply waiting. She wrung her hands, the fabric of her torn sleeve twisting between her fingers. "They're looking for me. On the train." The words tumbled out, small and scared. "They'll be here soon." Still, he said nothing. His silence was a wall, and she was throwing pebbles of words against it, hoping for a crack. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. It had been a foolish hope, a child's hope. Why would this man, this hard, solitary figure, risk anything for a ragged girl with fear in her eyes? He had no reason to. He owed her nothing. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury she'd lost long ago. She took one last, desperate gamble, the words tearing from her throat with the last of her courage. "Please, let me hide under your coat." The request hung in the air between them, absurd and intimate. It was a plea for more than just concealment. It was a plea for protection, a plea to be unseen, to be made small enough that the world might pass her by. It was the plea of a child asking to hide from a storm in the shelter of a great oak. For a long moment, the man, Eli Wade, just looked at her. His gaze moved from her terrified eyes, down to her torn dress, the scratches on her arms, her bare, dusty feet. He saw the story of her flight written on her body. He saw the desperation that had driven her to approach a complete stranger, an armed stranger, in the last car of a midnight train. He saw it all, and his expression did not change. There was no flicker of pity, no hint of curiosity, no spark of anything at all. The cold emptiness in his eyes remained. Clara's hope withered. She prepared to be dismissed, to be told to get lost, or worse. She braced herself for the harsh word, the cold gesture that would send her back out into the belly of the train, to face the men who were coming for her. She had played her only card, and it had failed. Then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, not a gesture of welcome, but one of simple, mechanical action. He shifted his weight, and with one hand, he lifted the edge of his heavy canvas duster. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just held the coat open, creating a small, dark cavern of shadow and worn fabric next to his body. It was not an invitation. It was an answer. Relief so sharp and potent it was almost painful shot through Clara. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward, ducking under the heavy fabric, huddling into the space he'd made. She pressed herself against the hard wall of the train car, trying to make herself as small as possible, her cheek brushing against the rough wool of his trousers. The duster fell around her. a heavy curtain that shut out the dim light of the car and the vast, moonlit desert beyond. The world was suddenly dark, close, and smelled of dust, leather, and him. It was a masculine scent, not unpleasant, but stark and unfamiliar. She could feel the warmth of his body through his clothes, a solid, living heat that was a strange comfort. She could hear the steady, slow beat of his heart, a rhythm entirely different from the frantic terror of her own. She held her breath, listening, waiting, from her hiding place. The world was reduced to the clatter of the wheels on the track and the presence of the silent man who had, for no reason she could understand, given her sanctuary. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who was hunting her or why. He had looked at her, seen her desperation, and simply opened his coat. And in that simple, wordless act, Clara found the first glimmer of hope she had felt in a very, very long time. Huddled in the darkness, Clara felt as though she had ceased to exist. The world had shrunk to the space beneath Eli Wade's coat, a cramped universe that smelled of dust, hoarse, and cold night air. The rhythmic, deafening clatter of the train wheels was both a lullaby and a torment. Each turn a mile further from her past, each clack a tick of the clock bringing her hunters closer. She pressed herself against the cold wooden wall of the car, her muscles coiled tight, every nerve ending screaming. She could feel the solid presence of the man beside her, a wall of warmth and stillness. His breathing was slow and even, a stark contrast to the frantic, shallow gasps she tried to stifle in the folds of his duster. Time became meaningless. It could have been minutes or an hour. Her mind, a wild animal in a cage, raced through horrifying possibilities. She pictured the door sliding open, saw the leering face of Jedediah, her so-called husband's head of security. He was a man with a wide, wet mouth and small, pig-like eyes that seemed to strip a person bare. She imagined his thick fingers closing around her arm, the triumphant cruelty in his voice as he dragged her back to that gilded cage of a saloon, back to a life that wasn't living. The thought sent a violent tremor through her body, and she bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. The coppery taste of blood, a sharp anchor in the swirling sea of her fear. Beside her, Eli shifted slightly. It was a minute movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to communicate a warning. He had felt her shudder. A moment later, she heard it too. A sound different from the train's familiar symphony of noise, the scrape and slam of the door from the next car over. Heavy, purposeful footsteps, not the shuffling of a weary passenger, but the determined tread of men on a mission. They were here! Clara's blood turned to ice. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could melt into the floorboards. The darkness under the coat was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. Any breath could betray her. Any movement could be her doom. She felt Eli's body tense, the muscles in his leg hardening like stone against her side. He remained utterly still, a predator sensing a threat, conserving every ounce of energy for the moment that was to come. The door to their car slid open with a rattling groan that seemed to echo the groan in Clara's soul. 3 figures were silhouetted against the lamplight from the passenger car. Even in the dimness, she knew them. The large, bulky frame of Silas, the wiry, twitchy form of Hank, and leading them, the stout, imposing figure of Jedediah. "Empty," Hank's reedy voice complained. "Told you she wouldn't come this far back. She's probably hiding with some family in the passenger cars." "She's got no family." Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, thick with menace. "And she's a cornered rat. Rats always run for the darkest hole they can find. Check the crates." Clara heard the scuff of their boots on the wooden floor as they moved into the car. Silas and Hank began clumsily inspecting the freight, their grunts and curses punctuations in the tense silence. Jedediah, however, moved with a different kind of energy. He was the hunter, scanning the shadows, his senses attuned to the scent of fear. His footsteps drew closer to their corner. Closer. Clara held her breath until her lungs burned. She could feel the vibrations through the floor as he approached. The fabric of the duster was the only thing separating her from his gaze. She pressed her face into the rough wool of Eli's trousers, praying for invisibility. "Well now." Jedediah's voice was dangerously soft and far too close. "What have we got here, a lone wolf enjoying the view?" Clara knew he was talking to Eli. She felt a profound, chilling stillness from the man beside her. He didn't answer. A boot nudged Eli's leg. Not a kick, but a deliberate, insolent prod. "I'm talking to you, friend. You deaf or just rude?" The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. Clara could picture the scene in her mind, the brutish man looming, Eli sitting motionless under the brim of his hat. Finally, Eli spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "I'm not your friend." Jedediah chuckled, a short, ugly sound. "Feisty one. I like that. We're looking for something. A girl? Young, pretty, hair the color of corn silk. Got a wild streak in her. You seen anyone like that?" "I've seen the desert," Eli replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "For the last 3 hours. Nothing else." "Is that so?" Jedediah's voice dripped with suspicion. "You're taking up a lot of space in that corner. Got something to hide under that big coat of yours, a bottle. Maybe you can share with us. We're thirsty men." This was it, the moment of discovery. Clara's heart stopped. She could feel the heat of Jedediah's presence, smell the cheap whiskey on his breath even through the coat. She waited for the fabric to be ripped away, for the cruel triumph in Jedediah's eyes. But the moment never came. Instead of an answer, there was an explosion of movement. It was so sudden, so violent, it took her breath away. Eli moved not like a man getting to his feet, but like a whip cracking. In one fluid motion, he was standing, his arm hooking around Clara's waist and yanking her from her hiding place. She let out a small, strangled gasp as she was hauled to her feet. For a split second, she was face to face with Jedediah, his eyes widening in shock and then narrowing in furious recognition. "There you are, you little—" His words were cut off. Eli didn't hesitate, didn't posture. He slammed the heel of his free hand into Jedediah's nose. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, and the big man staggered back, a choked cry of pain and rage erupting from his throat as blood streamed down his face. Hank and Silas turned, their expressions of stupid surprise shifting to anger. But Eli wasn't staying to fight. His grip on Clara was like an iron band. "Run," he snarled, the first real emotion she'd heard in his voice. It was a command, not a suggestion. He didn't look to see if she was following. He dragged her with him, his long strides eating up the length of the car. They ran towards the rear of the train, towards the heavy sliding door that led to nothing but open air and rushing darkness. Behind them, shouts of rage echoed. "Get them! Don't let them get away!" The wind roared as Eli wrenched the heavy door open. It was a physical assault, a screaming vortex of sand and speed that tore at their clothes and hair. The desert was a blur of motion, a terrifying, abstract painting of silver and black rushing past at an impossible velocity. The noise was immense, a combination of the wind's howl and the thunder of the wheels on the steel tracks. To jump seemed not just foolish, but suicidal. Clara faltered, her feet skidding on the floor, her mind screaming in protest. "We can't—" Eli didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just tightened his grip, pulling her flush against his side. He glanced back once, saw the two brutes, Silas and Hank, charging towards them, their faces contorted with fury. Jedediah was on his knees, holding his broken nose, but he was already trying to pull his gun. There was no time. There was no other way. He looked down at Clara. For a fleeting instant, his cold gray eyes met hers. In them, she saw no fear, only a grim, unyielding resolve. He wasn't asking her permission. He was telling her what was about to happen. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice barely audible above the gale. And then he jumped. He took her with him, launching them out of the train and into the roaring abyss. The world dissolved into a chaotic nightmare of sensation. There was a moment of pure, weightless terror as they hung suspended between the train and the earth. The wind ripped the air from her lungs. She saw the indifferent stars wheeling madly above her. Then came the impact. It wasn't a landing, it was a collision. They hit the sandy embankment at the side of the tracks with brutal force. The world became a violent, tumbling chaos. Sky and sand and stars and pain all blurred into one. She was thrown from Eli's grip, her body rolling, limbs flailing. The coarse sand was an abrasive, scraping her skin raw, filling her mouth, her nose, her eyes. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her shoulder as she hit a rock. And then she was just tumbling, over and over, a rag doll thrown from a window, until finally, mercifully, her momentum bled into the soft sand and she came to a stop. For a long moment, she lay there, stunned, every inch of her body screaming in protest. The only sound was the ringing in her ears and the fading rumble of the train as it continued its journey. A receding monster of light and noise, oblivious to the two human beings it had shed into the wilderness. Then, silence. A silence so profound, so absolute. It was more shocking than the noise that had preceded it. The desert night descended upon her, vast and cold and utterly empty. The moon and stars were the only witnesses. Slowly, painfully, Clara pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her body was a symphony of aches and sharp, stabbing pains. Her dress was torn in new places, and she could feel the warm stickiness of blood on her arms and cheek. She spat sand from her mouth and blinked, her vision slowly clearing. A few yards away, a dark shape was resolving itself in the moonlight. It was Eli. He was already on his feet, brushing sand from his duster. He seemed completely unfazed, as if jumping from a moving train was a regular occurrence for him. He moved with a stiff grace, checking himself for injuries. His hat was gone, and in the stark moonlight, she could see his face clearly for the first time. It was as she'd imagined, hard, angular, and framed by dark, shaggy hair. He looked over at her, his expression unreadable. He walked over to where she lay, his boots sinking into the sand with each step. He didn't offer a hand, didn't ask if she was hurt. He just stood over her, a tall, dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. His gray eyes surveyed her, cataloging the scrapes and the torn dress. He saw her shivering, from shock and the cold night air. The train was gone, its whistle a faint, lonely cry in the distance. They were alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone in the middle of the New Mexico desert. The men were gone, but a new, more impersonal danger surrounded them. Clara looked up at him, her throat too dry and sore to speak, her eyes wide with 1,000 unasked questions. "Who are you? Why did you help me? What do we do now?" Eli Wade seemed to hear them all, and to dismiss them all. He had acted, and the consequences were now a reality to be dealt with, not a subject for discussion. He bent down, not to help her, but to retrieve something from the sand, his hat. He slapped it against his thigh, sending a cloud of dust into the air, and settled it back on his head, instantly returning his face to shadow. He looked off into the darkness, towards the distant, jagged line of the mesas. Then he looked back down at her. He had saved her from one fate, only to deliver them both to another. Yet, standing there, covered in sand and bruises, with the immense, silent desert all around them, Clara felt a strange, new feeling pushing through the terror, for the first time since she had fled. She was not just running from something, she was with someone. Eli's voice cut through the silence, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. He didn't ask her why she was running, or who the men were. He didn't ask her name. He didn't waste a single word. He just stated the next necessary action. Follow me. The world reformed itself slowly, piece by painful piece. First came the cold, a deep, seeping chill that found its way through the thin fabric of her calico dress and settled in her bones. Then came the pain, a chorus of aches and stings from a dozen different scrapes and bruises, and finally, there was the silence, vast and absolute, broken only by the sibilant whisper of the wind sweeping across the sand. Clara pushed herself to a sitting position, every muscle protesting. The desert night was a crushing, immense presence. The sky a black velvet cloth punched through with 1,000,000 diamond-sharp stars. They were beautiful, but their beauty was cold, remote, and offered no comfort. Eli Wade stood a few feet away, a stoic shadow against the moonlight. He had already set a course, his gaze fixed on a distant, jagged notch in a line of low-slung mesas. His command, "Follow me," was not an invitation to a conversation. It was a statement of the only available reality. For a moment, Clara's spirit rebelled. Follow him where into that endless thirsty darkness? Her body screamed for rest, for water, for an end to this waking nightmare. But then she looked back in the direction the train had gone, and she imagined Jedediah's face, bloated with rage. She imagined his hands. The rebellion died in her throat, replaced by the cold, hard certainty that any direction away from him was the right one. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion and shock. The simple act of standing felt like a monumental achievement. Eli didn't look back to see if she was coming. He simply started walking, his long, ground-eating strides impossibly steady. Clara had no choice but to follow, half running, half stumbling to keep up, her bare feet sinking and sliding in the soft, cool sand. The first hour was a blur of misery. The sand gave way to harder ground littered with sharp rocks that bruised the soles of her feet. Skeletal cacti and thorny bushes reached out like grasping claws, tearing at her dress and scratching her skin. The wind was a constant, mournful companion, whipping her hair across her face and chilling her to the marrow. Eli moved through it all as if he were part of the landscape itself, his steps sure and silent. He never spoke, never slowed. He was a force of nature, and she was a broken piece of flotsam being dragged along in his wake. Her lungs burned. A sharp stitch of pain flared in her side. Each breath was a ragged, desperate gasp for air that felt too thin to provide any relief. Her mind began to drift, her thoughts becoming a disconnected jumble of fear and exhaustion. The only thing that kept her moving was the dark, steady shape of the man in front of her. He was her compass, her focus, the single point of reality in a disintegrating world. As long as he was moving, she had to move. To stop was to be swallowed by the desert, to be left for the buzzards, or, worse, for the men who were surely coming after them. After what felt like an eternity, as the moon began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Eli finally stopped. They had reached the mouth of a wide, dark arroyo, a dry riverbed carved into the earth. He gestured for her to stay put, his first communication in hours. Then he disappeared into the shadows. Clara collapsed onto the ground, her legs giving way completely. She lay there, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't have the energy to wonder where he'd gone or if he was coming back. For those few precious moments, the simple act of not moving was all that mattered. He returned as silently as he had left, his arms full of dry, brittle brushwood and sage. He dumped it in a pile a little ways from the arroyo's edge, in a spot that was open and exposed. Clara watched, confused, as he knelt and with a flint and steel from a pouch on his belt, expertly struck a spark. A tiny flame licked at the tinder, grew, and greedily consumed the dry wood. Within moments, a small, crackling fire was blazing, sending a plume of thick, pungent smoke straight up into the still night air. It was a beacon, a signal, a mad act that seemed designed to draw their hunters straight to them. A fresh wave of panic washed over Clara. "What are you doing?" she croaked, her voice raw. Eli didn't look at her. He added a few more green branches to the fire, making the smoke thicker and darker. "They'll stop the train at the next town," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They'll get horses. They'll ride back along the tracks, looking for where we jumped. They'll see the smoke. They'll figure we made a fire to keep warm." He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes found hers in the flickering firelight. "And they'll ride this way, which is why we're going that way." He pointed towards the dark, yawning mouth of the canyon. Understanding dawned on Clara, a slow, grudging spark of admiration for his cold, calculating logic. He wasn't just running, he was thinking. He was setting a trap for their minds, using their own expectations against them. The fire was not a beacon of hope. It was a lie written in smoke. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small, wrapped parcel. He tossed it to her. It was a piece of dried meat, tough and salty. Clara's stomach, which she hadn't realized was aching with hunger, clenched at the smell. She tore at the jerky with her teeth. The simple, savory taste an explosion of sensation on her tongue. It was the first thing she'd eaten since a stale piece of bread that morning, a lifetime ago. "Eat," Eli commanded. "We're not stopping again for a while." He gave the fire one last look, then turned and started down the steep, rocky slope into the arroyo. The descent was even more treacherous than their walk across the desert floor. The ground was loose scree that shifted and slid underfoot, more than once. Clara lost her footing, her bare feet slipping on the smooth stones. Each time, she caught herself with scraped hands, her heart leaping into her throat. Eli moved like a goat, his balance supernatural, his progress swift and sure. He never offered a hand, but she sensed he was aware of her every stumble, his pace just slow enough that she didn't get left behind. Down in the canyon, the world changed. The vast, open sky was replaced by a narrow ribbon of stars between towering rock walls. The wind died down, and the silence became even more profound. The air was cool and still. Here, they were hidden. The smoke from their decoy fire was invisible, and the sounds of their passage were swallowed by the immense stone walls. They walked on the sandy canyon floor, which was easier on Clara's bruised feet. For hours, they followed the winding path of the ancient riverbed. The walls rose and fell around them, sometimes opening up into wide amphitheaters, other times narrowing into tight passages where she could almost touch both sides at once. The moon cast long, distorted shadows that twisted into menacing shapes, playing tricks on her exhausted mind. Every dark alcove seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Clara's initial fear began to mingle with a strange sense of awe. There was a raw, brutal beauty to this place, a feeling of immense age and power that dwarfed her own small struggles. She was a tiny, fleeting thing in a world of eternal stone and stars. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Her problems, which had felt like the center of the universe, seemed to shrink in the face of this timeless landscape. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky was beginning to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple, Eli led them up a steep, narrow trail out of the arroyo. The climb was punishing. Clara had to use her hands, grabbing onto rocks and roots to pull herself up the incline. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs felt as if they were on fire, but she refused to stop. The stubborn, flickering flame of her will to survive had been fanned by Eli's competence. He hadn't offered her comfort, but he had offered her a chance, and she would not waste it. When they finally reached the top, she collapsed onto a flat ledge, her body trembling with a fatigue so profound it was almost sublime. Below them, the desert stretched out, now bathed in the soft, gray light of pre-dawn. She could just make out the faint, dissipating wisp of smoke from their decoy fire, miles away. It was a testament to their progress, a ghost of a lie that had, she prayed, worked. Eli stood on the edge of the ledge, surveying the landscape, He had given her no praise for keeping up, but he had allowed her this moment of rest. He passed her a canteen, and she drank the lukewarm, metallic-tasting water with a gratitude that was almost painful. As the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and pink, it revealed their surroundings in merciless detail. They were in a landscape of rolling, desolate hills, dotted with juniper trees and massive rock formations that had been sculpted by centuries of wind and water, and nestled deep within a small, protected valley below them, almost perfectly hidden from view, was a sight that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was a ranch, not a large one, but a ranch nonetheless, a small, sturdy-looking house built of adobe and dark wood, a stone well with a creaking windmill beside it, a corral with a few horses, and a barn whose roof sagged in the middle. It was a place of impossible sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, a pocket of life in a world of stone and sand. Hope, fierce and overwhelming, surged through Clara for the first time. It was so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This was where he had been leading her all night. This was his destination. The journey down into the valley was the last of her strength. By the time they reached the flat ground of the ranch yard, her legs were rubbery and unresponsive. She stumbled and fell to her knees in the soft dust, the last of her energy draining away. Eli walked past her and went to the water trough, plunging his head and shoulders into the cold, clear water. He came up sputtering, shaking his head like a dog, droplets of water flying through the air and glittering in the new morning sun. He looked over at her, still kneeling in the dust, her head bowed, her body trembling. He walked over and stood before her. She looked up, her face a mess of dirt, sweat, and dried blood, her eyes wide and pleading. She was broken, exhausted, but she was here. She had survived. Eli Wade looked down at the ragged, desperate girl at his feet. For the first time, the cold, empty landscape of his eyes seemed to hold a flicker of something else. It wasn't pity. It wasn't kindness. It was, perhaps, a simple acknowledgement of a shared ordeal, a recognition of the sheer, stubborn will that had gotten her this far. His voice was quiet, but the words landed with the weight of a promise, a benediction after a long night in hell. You'll be safe here. The first thing Clara knew was the light. It wasn't the harsh, unforgiving glare of the desert moon, but a soft, warm glow, filtered through what she vaguely recognized as imperfect glass. It painted a golden stripe across a simple, wooden planked ceiling. The second thing she knew was the absence of motion. The world was blessedly, profoundly still. No rattling wheels, no lurching gait, just a deep foundational quiet. She opened her eyes, wincing as the light sharpened. She wasn't in the dust of the ranch yard. She was lying in a bed, a real bed with a mattress stuffed with straw that rustled softly as she moved. A rough spun wool blanket was pulled up to her chin, and the pillowcase beneath her cheek, though worn thin and patched, smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. It was the most profound luxury she had experienced in months. Slowly, carefully, she sat up. A wave of dizziness washed over her, followed by the dull, protesting throb of her many bruises. She looked down at herself. Her torn, filthy dress was gone. In its place, she wore a simple, homespun cotton night shift that was far too large for her, but was immaculately clean. On a small wooden stool beside the bed sat a bowl of water, now cool, with a clean rag folded beside it. Her arms and face had been gently cleaned. The angry red of her scrapes was now muted. The skin around them no longer caked with dirt and blood. Someone had carried her in. Someone had tended to her wounds and changed her clothes while she was lost in the black, dreamless pit of her exhaustion. The thought sent a strange, complicated shiver through her. It was an act of such profound, unexpected care that she didn't know how to process it. Eli Wade, the silent, hard-eyed man from the train, had done this. The man who moved like a predator and spoke in monoliths of silence had shown a tenderness she hadn't known existed in the world, let alone in him. The room was small and Spartan. The walls were thick, whitewashed adobe, cool to the touch. The bed, the stool, and a small, scarred wooden chest were the only furniture. On the chest, her own tattered dress had been folded, and beside it lay a new set of clothes, a plain work dress of durable blue calico and a pair of sturdy-looking leather shoes. Clearly worn, but well cared for. They looked like they might have belonged to a boy, or a very small woman, once upon a time. A deep, primal instinct for self-preservation had kept her moving through the night. Now, in the safety of this quiet room, a different instinct surfaced, the need to not be a burden, to earn this sanctuary, however temporary it might be. She pushed herself out of bed, her feet touching the cool, smooth clay of the floor. She dressed quickly, the calico dress hanging loosely on her thin frame, but feeling like a suit of armor compared to her previous rags. The shoes were a little big, but she stuffed a piece of cloth from her old dress into the toes and they felt secure enough. Her first act was to make the bed. She pulled the blanket taut and smoothed the pillow, a small, domestic gesture that made her feel a little more human. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the bedroom and into the main room of the house. It was a single, large space that served as a kitchen, dining room, and living area. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. A heavy, rough-hewn table stood in the center of the room with 2 chairs. Shelves on the wall held a few tin plates, cups, and a small collection of books, their spines worn and faded. The entire place was like Eli himself, Spartan, functional, and stripped of any unnecessary adornment, yet possessed of a clean, orderly dignity. There was no sign of him. A pot of coffee sat on the hearth, still warm, and a half-eaten plate of bacon and beans was on the table. He had already eaten and gone. Clara felt a pang of anxiety. Had he left her here? Was he coming back? She pushed the thought away. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had been given a reprieve, and she would use it. She found the well outside, the windmill above it turning slowly with a gentle, rhythmic creak that was the ranch's heartbeat. The water was shockingly cold and tasted sweet and clean. She drank deeply, then washed her face and hands, the cold water a balm on her sore, scraped skin. The morning sun was warm on her back, a gentle, life-giving heat that felt like a blessing. For so long, the sun had been a harsh, oppressive force, something to be endured. Here, in the shelter of the valley, it was a friend. She took a moment just to stand there, to feel its warmth, to breathe in the clean air scented with dust, pine, and livestock. It was the first peaceful breath she had taken in nearly a year. But peace felt undeserved. Rest felt like a theft. She needed to do something, to contribute, to anchor herself to this place through action. She spotted a chicken coop behind the house, a flurry of feathered activity within. Finding a small bucket, she filled it with grain from a nearby sack and scattered it for the birds. Their happy, clucking sounds, a simple, cheerful music. Beside the coop was a small, thriving vegetable patch. It was overgrown with weeds, which were threatening to choke the tender shoots of corn and squash. Clara knelt in the soft, dark earth and began to pull them, her hands working with a steady, determined rhythm. The work was mindless, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. Each weed she pulled was a small victory, a tiny piece of order she could create in a world that had been nothing but chaos. She was not a possession being sold, not a victim being hunted. She was a girl, in a garden, pulling weeds. It was the most normal she had felt in an age. She was lost in the work, the sun warming her shoulders, when a small voice startled her. "Are you the one Eli brought?" Clara looked up, her heart jumping. Leaning against the fence of the chicken coop was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, small and wiry, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a constellation of freckles across his nose. He wore patched overalls and no shoes, his feet dusty from the yard. In his hands, he clutched a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by constant handling. His eyes were wide and intensely curious, a startlingly bright blue, and they regarded her with a seriousness that was far beyond his years. Clara's first instinct was fear, that she had transgressed, that she was somewhere she shouldn't be. But the boy's expression wasn't accusatory. It was just inquisitive. She offered him a small, hesitant smile. "I am," she said, her voice a little hoarse. "My name is Clara." The boy considered this for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. He pushed himself off the fence and walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "I'm Sam," he announced. He held up the wooden horse. "Eli made him for me. His name is Dusty." "It's a very fine horse." "Sam," Clara said softly, her fear melting away in the face of his childish gravity. A child. There was a child here. This knowledge shifted the very foundation of the place, changing it from a lone man's hermitage into something else entirely, something more like a home. Sam knelt in the dirt across from her, watching her hands as she resumed pulling the smaller weeds. "Eli doesn't bring people," he stated, as if sharing a piece of sacred scripture. "Just me." Clara's hands stilled. She looked at the small boy, at his patched clothes and solemn face, and 100 questions bloomed in her mind. But she didn't ask any of them. It wasn't her place. She simply nodded. "Well, I suppose he made an exception." "Are you in trouble?" Sam asked, his blue eyes direct and unflinching. The question was so simple, so direct, that it disarmed her completely. "Yes," she whispered, the admission a weight lifting from her chest. "I was—" "Me too," he said, with an air of quiet understanding. He looked down at the wooden horse in his hands, tracing its worn shape with a small, dirty finger. "I was in trouble. Before Eli." Clara waited, her breath held. She sensed that this was a story he needed to tell, a piece of his own history he was offering her as a strange sort of welcome. "I was in a mining town," Sam said, his voice dropping a little. "On the mean streets, no PA." He used the phrase mean streets as if it were a proper name, a place on a map. "It was cold, and there were bad men." He looked up at her, his eyes holding a shadow of a memory. "Eli came through. He was just buying supplies. He saw me. I was trying to steal some bread." He paused, and Clara could picture the scene perfectly. The small, starving boy. The tall, silent cowboy. "The storekeeper caught me," Sam continued. "He was he was real mad. But Eli, he just stepped in. He didn't say much, just paid for the bread and for a whole sack of other things. Then he looked at the storekeeper and said, 'The boy's with me.' And that was that." Sam's gaze drifted off towards the horizon, as if he were watching the memory unfold against the blue line of the distant mountains. "He found me on the mean streets," Sam said, his voice now a near whisper, filled with a quiet awe. "And he said I could stay." The simple, unadorned story struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. It was a mirror of her own experience, stripped down to its barest, most essential truth. A person in trouble, a silent, watchful man, and a sudden, inexplicable act of salvation. Eli hadn't just saved her. It was what he did. He collected lost things. He offered sanctuary to strays. He stood between the vulnerable and the cruel world and said, in his own quiet way, "This one's with me." All the fear, all the tension, all the desperate, clawing anxiety that had been her constant companion for months, finally broke. The wall she had built around her heart, brick by painful brick, crumbled. A sound escaped her lips, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in so long she barely recognized it. It was halfway between a sob and a laugh. And then, for the first time in more months than she could count, Clara smiled. It wasn't the small, hesitant smile she had offered the boy moments before. This was a real smile, wide and trembling, that started deep inside her and bloomed across her face, lighting her up from within. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, a smile of hope, a smile that acknowledged the profound, staggering realization that she had, against all odds, stumbled into the one place in the entire unforgiving desert where she might actually, truly, be safe. She looked at the solemn little boy with his wooden horse, a fellow piece of driftwood washed ashore, and her smile widened, chasing the last of the shadows from her eyes. A fragile peace settled over the valley in the days that followed. It was a quiet, tentative thing, like the first green shoots of grass after a long winter. Clara discovered the rhythms of the ranch, a simple, grounding cadence of work and rest that was a balm to her fractured soul. Mornings began before sunrise, the air cool and smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. She would fetch water from the well, its rhythmic creaking a familiar morning prayer. She would feed the chickens, their eager, bustling energy a small, bright spot of life. She learned the quiet company of Sam, who would often follow her as she worked, chattering about the shapes he saw in the clouds or the adventures of his wooden horse, Dusty. He never asked about her past again, accepting her presence with the simple, unquestioning logic of a child. Evenings were the quietest time, after a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and sometimes a piece of salted meat. Sam would curl up by the hearth, his head full of stories Eli would tell in his low, quiet rumble tales of clever coyotes, stubborn mountains, and the stars. Clara would listen, mending a shirt or shelling beans, feeling like a ghost at the edge of a family portrait. She was there, but she was not yet part of it. A chasm of unspoken history lay between her and this peaceful existence, a dark river of memory that she had to cross every night in her dreams. Eli remained a study in quiet competence. He spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He noticed the way she shivered in the evenings and left a heavy wool blanket draped over the chair she favored. He saw the worn soles of the shoes he'd given her and spent an evening meticulously repairing them with an awl and waxed thread, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. He never asked for anything, but he accepted the small contributions she made. He ate the stews she learned to cook, nodded his approval at the weed-free garden, and once, she saw him looking at a small, lopsided patch she had sewn onto his duster, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. They were 3 solitary islands, slowly, cautiously, beginning to feel the gravitational pull of one another. But Clara knew her own island was shrouded in a fog he could not see, and the isolation was a weight in her chest. The confession came on an evening like any other. A storm had rolled in over the mesas, and a cool, steady rain was drumming on the roof, a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. The 3 of them had eaten dinner, the fire in the hearth casting a warm, dancing light across the room. Sam, tired from a day of exploration, had fallen asleep with his head in Clara's lap, his small body a trusting weight against her. Eli had gently lifted him and carried him to his small bed in the corner, tucking the blanket around him with a practiced ease that spoke of long habit. Now, it was just the 2 of them. Eli sat at the table, cleaning his Colt with a small, oiled rag, the metallic clicks of the cylinder turning the only sound besides the rain and the crackling fire. Clara sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of coffee. The air was thick with a comfortable silence. Yet it felt different tonight. The rain, the fire, the sleeping child, it all conspired to create a sense of intimacy, of a sanctuary sealed against the night, and in that safety, the walls she had so carefully constructed around her past began to crumble. She found herself staring at her left hand, which rested on the table. It was bare, but she could still feel the ghost of the ring she had worn, its phantom weight, the way the cold gold seemed to burn into her skin. "My father was a dreamer," she began, her voice so soft it was nearly lost in the sound of the rain. Eli's hand stilled. He didn't look up, but she knew he was listening. His focus had shifted entirely from the gun to her. She took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the whorls in the wooden tabletop. He always dreamed of finding a fortune. Silver, land, a winning hand at cards. He said it was just around the corner, but the corner never came. There were only debts. The debts grew bigger every year. She traced a circle on the table with her finger, the shape of the ring she had thrown into a river 2 states away. "Last year, a man came to our town, Mr. Finch. He bought the saloon, the hotel, half the businesses on Main Street. He had a fortune, and he noticed me." The memory was slick and ugly. Finch's eyes, the color of muddy water, assessing her as if she were a horse he was considering buying. His smile, which never reached his eyes. "My father was in debt to him, deeply. One evening, he came home, happier than I'd seen him in years. He said all our troubles were over. He'd made an arrangement, a marriage contract." The words tasted like poison in her mouth. He said, "Mr. Finch was a respectable man, a good provider. He said I would be a fool to refuse." She finally dared to look up at Eli. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable, but his stillness was absolute. He was listening with an intensity that was more unnerving and more comforting than 1,000 questions. "It wasn't a marriage," she whispered, the shame of it a hot flush on her cheeks. "It was a bill of sale. My father's debts were cleared. He was given a stake in a new business venture, and I was the price." She looked down at her hands again, twisting them in her lap. "Mr. Finch gave me a ring. It was heavy, with a gaudy stone in it. He liked to see it on my finger. He liked to show me off in his saloon, like I was his prize mare. I was another one of his possessions, something his money had bought." She could feel the phantom clutch of Finch's hand on her arm, the smell of whiskey and stale cigars that always clung to him. She fought back a wave of nausea. I tried to be the dutiful daughter, the good wife, but every day, a piece of me died. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, it was like I wasn't a person. I was just a thing. And my father, he wouldn't even look me in the eye anymore. He had gotten his dream, and he couldn't stand to look at the cost of it. Tears began to well in her eyes, hot and thick. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since she'd fled. She wouldn't. She blinked them back fiercely. The night I ran, Finch had some business partners over. They were drinking, playing cards. He'd made me serve them. The way they all looked at me, laughing. She shuddered, unable to finish the thought. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I would rather die in the desert than let another sunrise find me in that house. So I waited until they were all passed out from the drink. I took the ring from my finger and left it on his pillow. And I took the money he'd left on the dresser from his winnings. 20 silver dollars. It felt like I was stealing back a tiny piece of my own soul. I put on my oldest dress, and I ran. I just ran. The story was out. A torrent of words that left her feeling hollowed out and trembling. She had said it all. The ugly, shameful truth of her existence. She waited for the judgment, the disgust, the cold dismissal. She had been sold like cattle. She was stolen property. She was nothing. Eli still had not moved. He finished reassembling his pistol, the final click echoing in the quiet room. He set the gun down on the table, its dark metal gleaming in the firelight. He looked at her hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the tabletop. He saw them trembling. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a word of pity or condemnation. He simply reached across the table and picked up a clean, dry dishcloth that was folded nearby. He pushed it gently across the wood towards her. An offering, something to hold on to, something to wipe her unseen tears. The simple, practical gesture broke her. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She took the cloth, its rough, homespun texture a grounding reality in her hand. She clutched it like a lifeline. Her voice, when she spoke again, was a raw, broken whisper, heavy with the weight of her confession and the crushing burden of her past. I ran for weeks, hiding, starving. I didn't think I'd ever be safe again. She looked at him, her eyes finally meeting his, pleading for him to understand the deepest, most painful part of it all. I thought I wasn't worth saving. The silence that followed Clara's confession was not empty. It was a vast, still space, filled with the weight of her spoken past. In the days that followed, the rain passed, and the rhythms of the ranch resumed. But the atmosphere between them had changed in a way that was as profound and elemental as a shift in the seasons. Eli did not speak of what she had told him. He asked no questions, offered no words of hollow pity. His demeanor remained as stoic and impenetrable as the canyon walls that guarded their valley. And yet, Clara felt seen. The story of her life, a thing of shame and shadow she had carried like a sack of stones, was now known to him. She had expected it to change his perception of her, to taint her in his eyes. She had braced herself for a subtle withdrawal, a new coldness, a confirmation of her own deeply held belief that she was spoiled goods, a thing not worth saving. But none of that came. Instead, there was a new quality to his presence, a quiet attentiveness that hadn't been there before. When he passed her a cup of coffee in the morning, his fingers no longer seemed to accidentally brush hers. They seemed to consciously avoid it, a gesture not of revulsion, but of a strange, unpracticed respect. When she spoke, he would stop what he was doing and turn his head fully towards her, his gray eyes patient, giving her words his undivided attention. He had heard her story, and he had not turned away. He had not flinched. He had simply taken her truth and folded it into the quiet landscape of their shared existence. The knowledge of this settled inside Clara, a fragile and tentative warmth. She had given him the worst of herself, and he had held it without breaking. This silent acceptance was a greater gift than any words could ever be. Gratitude began to bloom in her chest, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was a feeling that demanded expression, but she had no words for it. Words were clumsy, inadequate things, and they were not the language of this valley. One afternoon, she and Sam went exploring along the creek that trickled through the bottom of the valley. It was Sam's favorite pastime, searching for interesting rocks and tracking the prints of rabbits and deer in the soft mud. Clara found herself relaxing in the boy's cheerful, uncomplicated company. With him, she was not a refugee or a victim. She was just Clara, the person who could lift him up to reach the low-hanging branches of a cottonwood tree, the one who knew how to weave blades of grass into a passable imitation of a ring. As Sam chased a lizard into a patch of sun-drenched rocks, Clara's eyes were drawn to a flash of color. There, growing from a tiny fissure in a large, gray boulder, was a single wildflower. It was a small, stubborn thing, its petals a shade of deep, vibrant blue, the color of the sky just before dusk. It had no business growing in such a place, with so little soil and so much stone. It was a miracle of resilience, a testament to the power of life to find a foothold in the most unforgiving of circumstances. She stood looking at it for a long time. The flower was a reflection of how she was beginning to feel small, fragile, yet stubbornly alive. It was a piece of unexpected beauty in a world of harsh reality. It was hope, embodied in 5 delicate blue petals. On impulse, she reached out and gently plucked it, its stem thin and wiry in her fingers. She held it for the rest of the afternoon, its vibrant color a secret joy in her palm as she and Sam made their way back to the ranch. As the sun began to dip below the mesas, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, she knew what she had to do. Eli had a ritual. Every evening, after the work was done, he would sit on the top step of the porch, facing west. He would drink a cup of coffee and watch the sky bleed from blue to orange to purple, a silent communion with the end of the day. Clara would often sit on the far end of the porch, mending clothes, the two of them sharing the sunset in a comfortable, wordless companionship. That evening, before he came out, she crept onto the porch, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the spot on the rough-hewn wooden railing next to his step where he always placed his cup. With trembling fingers, she laid the single blue wildflower there. It was such a small thing, a speck of color against the weathered gray wood. It could be dismissed, ignored, blown away by the evening breeze, but it was all she had to offer. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. It was a quiet testament that said, "You gave me sanctuary in a world of stone, and I am beginning to find beauty here again. Because of you." She retreated into the house before he could see her, her cheeks flushed, feeling as vulnerable as she had the night of her confession. A few minutes later, she heard the familiar creak of the door and the sound of his boots on the porch, from the shadows of the kitchen. She watched. She saw him stop. He stood for a long moment, looking down at the railing. He didn't move. In the dimming light, she couldn't see his expression. Then, he very gently picked up the flower, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly delicate. He didn't put it in his hatband or his buttonhole. He simply held it in his palm as he sat down, placing it carefully on the step beside him while he drank his coffee and watched the last of the sun disappear. When he came back inside, the flower was gone, and he said nothing. Clara's heart sank a little. Perhaps he had just tossed it away. Perhaps the gesture had been foolish, childish. Later that night, long after Sam and Clara were asleep, Eli sat at the table, a single lamp casting a circle of golden light around him. He pulled a small, leather-bound journal from an inside pocket of his duster. It was a battered, well-traveled object, its pages filled with his sharp, angular script notes about weather patterns, tallies of cattle, crude but accurate maps of canyons and waterholes. It was the practical ledger of a practical man's life. He opened it to a clean page near the back. From his shirt pocket, he carefully produced the small blue wildflower. Its petals were already beginning to wilt slightly, but its color was still true. He laid it flat on the page, its vibrant blue a shocking contrast to the cream-colored paper and black ink. He smoothed the petals with the pad of his thumb, a gesture of almost reverent care. Then he closed the book, the weight of the pages pressing the small, fragile offering of gratitude into the permanent, secret record of his life. He sat there for a long time, his hand resting on the cover of the book, before blowing out the lamp and plunging the room into darkness. The next day, nothing was said. The morning unfolded in its usual rhythm of chores and quiet companionship. But when the afternoon sun began to slant across the yard, Clara took her mending basket and went to her usual spot on the far end of the porch, and she stopped dead. Her spot was no longer just a patch of hard, splintery wood. Lying there was a small, perfectly cut square of thick, supple leather, tanned to the color of rich earth. It was a cushion, simple and unadorned, but clearly made with care, its edges neatly trimmed, and sitting in the middle of it was a tin cup, beaded with condensation, filled to the brim with cool, fresh water from the well. Clara stared at the offering, her throat tightening with an emotion she couldn't name. It was such a simple, practical thing. He had seen her sitting on the hard porch day after day. He had noticed her discomfort, and he had provided a solution. He had seen her thirst in the afternoon heat, and he had provided relief. It wasn't a poem or a declaration. It was an answer, written in his own language of leather and water, of pragmatic, observant care. Her small, ephemeral gift of a flower, which lived for only a day, had been answered with this: something solid, something useful, something meant to last. She slowly sat down on the leather cushion. It was soft and surprisingly comfortable. She picked up the cup, the cold metal a shock against her warm hands, and drank the water. It was the sweetest, coolest water she had ever tasted. As she sat there, looking out at the valley, she understood. The flower had been her way of saying, "I see you." The cushion and the water were his way of saying, "I see you too." Later, as he crossed the yard from the barn to the house, their eyes met. There was no need for words. A universe of understanding passed between them in that silent, shared glance. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and Clara, feeling the soft leather beneath her and the coolness of the water in her belly, offered him a small, genuine smile. They hadn't spoken of her past, and they hadn't spoken of their present. They had no words for the delicate, tentative thing that was beginning to grow between them in the shelter of the valley, but in the language of wildflowers and water, of silent gestures and shared sunsets. They were beginning to say everything that mattered. Each action was an acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation that two solitary, wounded souls had found each other in the vastness of the desert, and were, against all odds, learning how to heal. The peace of the valley was a living thing, a delicate ecosystem built on silent understanding and the steady rhythm of the sun. It had seeped into Clara's bones, soothing the frantic, hunted terror that had been her constant companion. She had begun to feel the earth beneath her feet, to notice the subtle shift of the wind, to believe, in some small, fragile part of her soul, that the sanctuary was real. The quiet days had woven themselves into a tapestry of fragile hope. The afternoon was warm and still, the sun a lazy, golden orb in a vast blue sky. Clara sat on the porch steps, a worn primer open in her lap, while Sam sat beside her, laboriously tracing the letters with a small, grubby finger. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he sounded out a word. H-O-R-S-E. "Horse!" he shouted, his face breaking into a triumphant grin. Clara smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her eyes. "That's right, Sam. Very good." The smell of a simmering stew drifted from the open kitchen door. Eli was in the corral, his back to them, working with a young colt, his movements slow and patient, his low voice a calming murmur that carried on the still air. An old man Clara had come to know as Raoul, who worked for Eli and lived in a small cabin further down the creek, had ridden out that morning to check the fences along the north ridge. It was a scene of such profound, simple domesticity that it felt like a dream. It was a life she had never imagined could be hers. It was a life built on a foundation of unspoken truths and shared solitude. And it was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the air. The horses in the corral suddenly grew restless, their ears twitching, heads lifting to stare intently at the mouth of the valley. The colt shied away from Eli, letting out a nervous whicker. Eli went still. It was an absolute, predatory stillness that sent a cold spike of fear through Clara's chest. He didn't turn his head, but his entire body became a listening device, attuned to the slightest disturbance. He straightened up slowly, his hand resting almost casually on the worn grip of the colt at his hip. Clara's smile faded. She followed his gaze to the narrow, rocky entrance to their hidden world. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, 3 figures on horseback appeared, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. They were not moving fast. They were walking their horses, a slow, confident, menacing pace, the pace of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. Eli turned his head, and his eyes met Clara's across the yard. The cold, gray flint was back, all traces of the quiet rancher gone, replaced by the dangerous man from the train. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, but it carried the absolute weight of command. "Clara, get the boy inside, now!" The dream shattered. The peaceful afternoon dissolved into a nightmare of adrenaline and ice-cold dread. "Sam," she said, her voice tight and unnatural. "Inside. Let's go." "Sam." sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in the adults, scrambled to his feet without a word and ran for the house. Clara followed, her legs feeling like lead, her gaze locked on the three approaching riders. As they drew closer, the brutal reality hit her. It was them. The bulky frame of Silas, the wiry, rat-like figure of Hank, and leading them, his face a mask of cruel triumph, was Jedediah. His nose was still crooked and swollen from the blow Eli had given him. His small, piggish eyes were fixed on the house, on her. She slammed the heavy wooden door behind her and through the bar, a futile gesture against the coming storm. She found Sam huddled under the main table, his small body trembling. She slid under it with him, pulling him close, her arms a fragile shield around his shaking shoulders. "It's all right," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "We're just playing a game." Outside, the riders stopped in the middle of the yard. The silence was deafening. Wade Jedediah's voice boomed, thick with malice. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got what belongs to Mr. Finch. Send the girl out, and we might just let you live." Clara heard the scrape of Eli's boots in the dirt. She peeked through a crack in the door. He had moved away from the corral, placing himself squarely between the riders and the house. He stood alone in the vast yard, a solitary figure of defiance. "She's not going anywhere." Eli's voice was calm, but it cut through the air like a razor. "You've got no business here. Ride out now." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "I think we do. We followed your trail for weeks. You're clever, I'll give you that, but not clever enough. Now, for the last time." The world exploded in a deafening roar. Clara flinched, pulling Sam tighter. It wasn't one of the riders. It was Eli. He hadn't waited for the threat to be finished. He had drawn and fired in a single, fluid motion. It wasn't aimed at a man. Hank's horse screamed, a high, terrifying sound, and collapsed, throwing its rider to the ground. The yard erupted into chaos. Gunshots answered Eli's, the reports cracking and echoing, a deadly cacophony that filled the small valley. Eli was already moving, diving behind the stone wall of the well, the adobe bricks spitting dust as bullets slammed into it. Jedediah and Silas spurred their horses apart, spreading out, their guns blazing. Hank, disentangling himself from his dead horse, scrambled for cover behind the water trough, firing his pistol wildly. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her hands over Sam's ears, trying to block out the terrifying sounds of the battle. The thunder of the guns, the shouts of the men, the splintering of wood as a stray bullet hit the doorframe. This was her fault. She had brought this violence, this death, to this peaceful place. She had led the wolves to the only sanctuary she had ever known. She forced herself to look again. Eli was a blur of motion, firing with a deadly, economical precision from behind the well. He was outnumbered, but he was smarter. He used the cover, his shots carefully aimed, forcing them to stay back, but they were relentless, and they were spreading out. She saw Silas dismount and sprint, low and fast, for the cover of the barn on the far side of the yard. He was flanking him. Panic seized Clara. Eli was pinned down, focused on Jedediah and Hank at the front. He wouldn't see Silas coming from the side. She was trapped, a helpless witness to his execution. The house, her sanctuary, was now a cage. She and Sam were the bait in the trap. The gunfire from the front intensified, a furious fusillade designed to keep Eli's head down. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Any second now, a shot would come from the barn, a shot Eli wouldn't see. And then it came. Not from the barn, but from inside the house, the back window, the one in the small bedroom, shattered inward, glass flying across the floor. A new wave of terror, more immediate and personal than anything before, washed over her. Silas hadn't gone into the barn to shoot Eli. He had gone around the house. He was coming for them. She heard his heavy boots crunching on the broken glass in the other room. "Come on out, little lady." His voice was a sing-song, predatory taunt. "We've got a long ride home." Sam let out a small, terrified whimper. That sound, the sound of the child's fear, broke through Clara's paralysis. The terror for Eli, for herself, was eclipsed by a fierce, primal instinct she didn't know she possessed. The instinct to protect this child. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate. And then she saw it, resting on two wooden pegs above the fireplace, coated in a thin layer of dust, was an old, double-barreled shotgun. It was a relic, a tool for hunting, not for fighting. Silas's shadow fell across the doorway from the bedroom. He was a large, hulking figure, his face split by a greasy, triumphant grin. His pistol was in his hand, held loosely at his side. He saw them huddled under the table. "There you are," he chuckled. "Like two little rats in a nest." In that moment, Clara moved. She didn't think, she reacted. She scrambled out from under the table, putting herself between Silas and the boy. "Get away from him," she snarled, her voice a low, trembling thing she didn't recognize as her own. Silas just laughed. "Or what, you gonna scold me to death?" He took a step into the room. Clara lunged for the fireplace, her fingers fumbling as she pulled the heavy shotgun from its pegs. It was heavier than she had imagined, the woodstock unfamiliar and awkward in her hands. She turned, leveling the long barrels at Silas's chest. Her arms shook so violently she could barely hold it steady. The sight of the gun wiped the smile from Silas's face. "Put that down, girl," he said, his voice losing its confident swagger. "You don't know how to use that thing." He was right. She didn't. Her thumb fumbled for the hammers. She could feel her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. But she saw the look in his eyes, the greed, the cruelty. And she saw Sam cowering behind her, and a cold, hard resolve settled in her stomach. Outside, the gunfire suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. "Eli!" Jedediah's voice roared in triumph. The sound was followed by a sickening thud, a sound of heavy impact, and a low grunt of pain. Clara's blood ran cold. He was down, Eli was down, and now it was just them. Silas heard it too. His confidence returned. "Sounds like your man is out of the fight," he sneered, taking another step towards her. "Now it's just you, me, and the boy. Drop the gun." He raised his pistol. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the dark, round hole of his pistol barrel. She heard Sam's ragged, terrified breathing behind her. She thought of Eli, lying bleeding in the dirt. And she thought of the blue wildflower, a symbol of a life she refused to let these men take from her. Her thumb found one of the hammers and pulled it back. The click was deafeningly loud in the silent room. Her finger found the trigger. Just as Silas started to move, another sound split the air, not from inside the house, but from high above, the sharp, distinctive crack of a powerful rifle. It was a sound entirely different from the pistol shots. Silas's eyes went wide in surprise. A small, dark hole appearing as if by magic in his shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the wall. He cried out in pain and surprise, his pistol clattering to the floor. Before anyone could react, the rifle cracked again. From the yard, Hank screamed and fell, clutching his leg. Jedediah, who had been standing over Eli's unconscious form with a rifle butt raised to deliver another blow, spun around, his face a mask of confusion, searching for the source of the attack. Clara looked out the broken window. On the high ridge at the north end of the valley, the one Raoul had ridden out to check that morning, a lone figure stood, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the end of a long rifle. It was Raoul. The old man had returned. Jedediah saw him too. He looked at the old man on the ridge, then at the wounded Hank, then at the house where Silas had disappeared. The fight had turned. He was exposed, outgunned. With a final curse, he abandoned the fight. scrambling for his horse and galloping madly out of the valley. Inside the house, Silas was clutching his shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. He stared at Clara, at the shotgun still leveled at his chest, its hammer pulled back. He saw the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a frightened girl anymore. It was the look of something far more dangerous. He scrambled to his feet and staggered out the door, half running, half falling, in the direction his leader had fled. The sudden silence was absolute. The ringing in Clara's ears was the only sound. The immediate threat was gone. She was still standing, the heavy shotgun in her hands. Sam was safe behind her. She looked down at the weapon, at the cold, dark metal, a thing of terrifying power. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her arms gave out, and she let the gun clatter to the floor. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Then the reality of what had happened outside crashed down on her. "Eli," she breathed. She ran out the door, her bare feet heedless of the broken glass and scattered debris. The yard was a scene of carnage. Hank was trying to drag himself away, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. The dead horse lay in a heap, and by the well, Eli lay motionless, face down in the dirt, a dark, spreading stain matting his hair. She fell to her knees beside him, her trembling hands hovering over his still form, afraid of what she would find. "Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please." Sam ran out and clung to her dress, his small body racked with silent sobs. Clara put a protective arm around him, but her eyes never left the unmoving form of the man who had saved her, the man she had just watched fall. The peace of the valley was gone, replaced by the smell of gunpowder and blood, and in the silence, a new, more terrible fear began to dawn. The fight was over, but the battle for his life had just begun. Time fractured. The world dissolved into a series of disconnected, nightmarish snapshots. The sharp, metallic scent of blood, the dust kicked up by Jedediah's fleeing horse, the sight of Raoul, the old ranch hand, scrambling down the ridge, his face a grim mask of concern. And at the center of it all, Eli's still silent form, a fallen monument in the dirt. Raoul reached them first, his movements surprisingly swift for a man of his years. He knelt beside Eli, his weathered hands gentle but efficient as he felt for a pulse at Eli's neck. He looked up at Clara, his dark, deep-set eyes conveying a world of grim understanding. "He's alive," he said, his voice a gravelly reassurance. "But this is bad. We need to get him inside." The next hour was a blur of frantic, desperate action. Together, they managed to half-drag, half-carry Eli's dead weight into the house and onto his own bed. The effort was immense, and through it all, Eli remained limp, a terrible, unnerving stillness that felt like a prelude to death. They stripped him of his gun belt and dusty clothes, and Clara saw the bruises already beginning to bloom across his torso. But it was his head that held their terrified focus. Raoul gently washed away the blood, revealing a deep, ugly gash and a swelling that distorted the side of his skull. The blow from the rifle butt had been meant to kill. "There's nothing to do for a wound like this but wait," Raoul said, his voice low as he looked at Eli's pale, unconscious face. "We keep him clean, keep him warm. The rest is up to him and God." Raoul took care of the grim necessities outside, dealing with the wounded Hank and the aftermath of the fight, his rifle always close at hand. He sent Sam to his own small cabin down the creek, promising to look after him, insulating the boy from the grim vigil that was to come. And then Clara was alone with Eli in the quiet house, alone with the man who had fallen for her. The first day and night were a crucible of fear and guilt. The house that had been her sanctuary became a hushed, sacred sick room. The world shrank to the 4 adobe walls of the bedroom, to the still figure in the bed. Clara sat in a wooden chair beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. Every breath he took was a victory. Every long pause between breaths was an eternity of terror. Guilt was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She had brought this plague upon his house. She had been the lure that had led the wolves to his door. She looked at his face, so still and pale beneath his dark, sweat-dampened hair, and saw the cost of her own survival. He had saved her, and she had destroyed him. The thought was a relentless, silent scream in her mind. By the second day, the fear and guilt began to burn away, leaving behind something harder, something forged in the fire of her desperation, a fierce, unyielding resolve. The screaming in her mind quieted, replaced by a single, determined whisper. "You will not die." It was not a plea. It was a command, a promise. She owed him this. She owed him everything. Her vigil became a ritual of care, a battle fought with cool water and soft cloths. The fever came, a dry, malevolent heat that radiated from his skin. She bathed his face, his neck, his chest, her movements tireless. She learned the landscape of his unconsciousness, the low, delirious muttering of names she didn't know, the restless twitching of his limbs as he fought battles in the darkness of his mind. Raoul would come twice a day, bringing broth, fresh water, and sometimes herbs that he would steep into a pungent, medicinal tea. For the fever, he'd say, his eyes full of a quiet, compassionate sorrow. He showed her how to spoon a few drops of water between Eli's cracked lips, a painstaking process that felt like a monumental achievement when a single drop was successfully swallowed. Each day was a war, and each tiny sign of life was a hard-won victory. The first victory was that swallow of water. After hours of gently trying, she saw the muscles in his throat work, a faint, reflexive motion. It was a sign that some part of him was still connected, still fighting. She felt a surge of hope so fierce it made her dizzy. The second victory came on the third day. She was changing the bandage on his head, her touch as gentle as she could make it. When his eyelids fluttered, they didn't open, but for a split second, the veil of his coma seemed to thin. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Eli," she whispered, her voice tight. There was no other response, but it was enough. He was still in there, somewhere in the deep, dark labyrinth of his injury. Her helplessness was a torment. She couldn't fight his fever. She couldn't heal his wound. All she could do was be there, a steadfast presence against the encroaching darkness. She began to talk to him, her voice a low, constant murmur in the quiet room. At first, it was just pleading. "Please, Eli, come back, please." But the pleading felt empty. So she began to tell him things, small, simple things. She told him about the world outside the window, the world he was missing. "Raoul says the colt is doing well," she'd whisper, her hand resting on the edge of the bed, not yet daring to touch him. "He let me give him an apple today. He has the softest nose." She would tell him about Sam. "Sam misses you. He asked me to tell you that his horse, Dusty, went on a great adventure to the top of the creek today." She was trying to weave a rope of ordinary life, a thread of words to lead him out of the darkness. She talked about the garden, the chickens, the way the light fell across the valley floor in the morning. She described the world he had given her, trying to make it so real, so tangible, that he would have no choice but to return to it. On the fourth day, she felt a new kind of desperation. The silence of the room felt heavy, oppressive. His stillness felt more permanent, needing another voice, any voice, to fill the space. She went to the small shelf of books in the main room. She chose the thinnest, most worn volume, its cover softened by the touch of countless hands. It was a small book of poems and fables. She sat in the chair by his bed and she began to read. Her voice was hesitant at first, stumbling over the words, but as she continued, her voice grew stronger. The rhythm of the simple verses a calming cadence in the tense, quiet room. She read about brave knights and clever foxes, about changing seasons and the steadfastness of the stars. She didn't know if he could hear her, if the words were reaching him in his deep, silent prison, but she read on, because it was the only thing she could do. The sound of her own voice, telling stories of life and struggle and hope, became an anchor for her as much as she prayed it was for him. That evening, as the light began to fade, she sat beside him, the book lying open in her lap. The fever, which had raged for days, finally seemed to be receding. His skin was no longer burning to the touch. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and, for the first time, she took his hand. It lay limp and unresponsive in hers, his skin dry, his fingers calloused and strong, even in stillness. She laced her smaller, softer fingers through his, a jolt of connection, however one-sided, running through her. She held his hand and watched his face in the growing twilight, her thumb stroking the back of his knuckles. "You have to come back." "Eli," she whispered, the words raw with an emotion she didn't dare name. "Sam needs you. This place needs you." She paused, her throat tight. "I need you." The confession hung in the air, a fragile, terrifying truth. She was no longer just paying a debt. Her vigil was no longer just an act of atonement. Somewhere in the long, dark hours of bathing his brow and whispering stories into the silence, her fierce gratitude had transformed, deepened, into something else entirely. It was a terrifying, aching, and powerful love for this silent, broken man. She sat like that for a long time, holding his hand, the weight of her confession settling around them. She must have dozed off, her head slumped against the back of the chair, her hand still holding his. She was awakened by a sensation, a faint pressure, a barely perceptible movement against her fingers. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at their joined hands. Had she imagined it? Then she felt it again, stronger this time, a weak but deliberate squeeze. Her head shot up, her gaze flying to his face. His eyes were open, not fluttering, not unfocused. They were open, and they were looking at her. There was confusion in them, and a deep, soul-weary pain. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of recognition. He saw her. "Eli," she breathed, the name a prayer. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His gaze held hers, a thousand questions passing in the silent space between them. He looked down at their hands, at her fingers intertwined with his. He looked back up at her face. And then, his hand squeezed hers again. It was a weak, trembling gesture, the effort of a man pulling himself back from the very edge of oblivion. But it was an answer. It was a confirmation. It was the first word in a conversation she had been having all by herself for days. He was here. He was back. Tears she hadn't known she'd been holding back streamed down her face. Tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a relief so profound it felt like a physical release. She brought his hand to her cheek, pressing his rough knuckles against her wet skin. She didn't need to speak. In the profound, speaking silence of the room, with his hand holding hers, she knew that he had heard her. The days that followed Eli's return to consciousness were a slow, quiet dawn. The stark terror of the vigil receded, replaced by the gentle, meticulous work of healing. At first, he was a shadow of the man he had been, weak and unsteady, his movements slow, his words few and far between. The fierce, self-sufficient energy that had defined him was banked, like the embers of a fire that had almost been extinguished. Clara's role shifted from desperate nurse to quiet, steady caregiver. She and Raoul brought Sam back to the house, and the boy's presence was a vital medicine. Sam, with his innocent, unwavering belief in Eli's strength, seemed to will him back to health. He would sit by Eli's bed, chattering about his day, showing Eli the smoothest stones from the creek or a feather he'd found, expecting nothing but the simple, comforting presence of the man who was the center of his world. Clara found a new rhythm. She cooked broths and stews, her focus on providing nourishment, on rebuilding him from the inside out. When he was finally strong enough to sit in a chair on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against a cool breeze, she would read to him and Sam, the simple stories a shared language that bridged the gap of his weakness and her lingering fear. In these quiet, convalescent days, the unspoken bond between them deepened. He would watch her as she worked, his gray eyes, now clear and thoughtful, following her as she swept the floor or tended the fire. He saw the new, quiet confidence in her movements, the way she moved about the house as if she belonged there. He saw the easy, gentle affection she had for Sam, the way her face would soften when the boy laughed. He saw the person she was becoming in the sanctuary he had provided, and in her strength, he seemed to find his own. The first time he stood on his own, the world seemed to hold its breath. He was shaky, his hand braced against the wall, but he was upright. Clara was there, a step away, her hands hovering, ready to catch him. But she let him find his own balance. He took a single, difficult step, then another. It was a victory as profound as any he had ever won in a fight. From that day on, his recovery quickened. As strength returned to his limbs, the life of the ranch began to flow back into its old channels, but with a new, altered current. He couldn't yet ride or do the heavy work, so he took on the small, necessary tasks. He would sit in a patch of sunlight, mending a bridle, the familiar work of his hands a way of reasserting his place in the world. Clara would work nearby, weeding the garden, and the space between them would be filled with the comfortable, companionable sounds of shared labor, the scrape of her hoe in the dirt, the rhythmic pull of his waxed thread through leather. They rarely spoke of the attack. The memory of it was a scar on the valley, a ghost that lingered in the splintered door frame and the dark stains in the yard that the rain had not quite washed away. But the shared trauma had forged a bond between them that words could not articulate. They had faced the darkness together, and they had survived. One afternoon, Clara was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts, the clean, damp sheets billowing in the breeze, brilliant white against the deep blue sky. Eli was repairing a coupe door, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer a steady heartbeat in the quiet afternoon. Sam was chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass nearby, his delighted shrieks a joyful counterpoint. Clara paused, a clothespin in her hand, and simply watched. She saw Eli look up from his work, his gaze drawn by Sam's laughter. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. His eyes then lifted and found hers. He held her gaze across the sun-drenched yard, and in that long, silent look, a profound, unspoken truth was exchanged. They were not just three survivors sharing a space. They were not a man, a boy, and a woman hiding from the world. In the shared glance, in the warmth of the sun and the sound of the child's laughter, she saw the unmistakable shape of a family. Her heart ached with a feeling so full, so overflowing, it felt like it might break. This was home. This strange, silent man and this little lost boy were her home. The seasons began to turn. The fierce heat of summer softened, and the mornings took on a crisp, cool edge. The cottonwood trees along the creek began to burnish with gold. Eli was fully recovered now. His strength returned, though a faint, silver scar remained at his hairline, a permanent reminder of how close he had come to the edge. He and Clara worked side by side, a seamless, unspoken partnership. They moved together with an easy, practiced grace, whether they were harvesting the last of the squash from the garden or working to shore up the barn roof before the winter snows. Their evenings settled into a peaceful ritual. After a simple meal, Sam would eventually succumb to sleep, and they would sit by the fire. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution or uncertainty. It was a shared quiet, rich and deep, filled with an easy companionship. Sometimes he would read from one of the worn books, his low voice a comforting rumble in the warm room. Sometimes she would talk, telling him small stories from her own childhood, before her father's dreams had soured. Speaking of a mother she barely remembered who had loved to bake bread and sing off-key. He was a patient, profound listener, and in sharing these small, untainted pieces of her past, she felt as though she were reclaiming herself. She was no longer the terrified girl on the train. The fear that had been her shadow for so long had receded, banished by the steady, grounding reality of this life. She had learned to fire the shotgun, not with the panicked terror of that day, but with a steady hand, her jaw set. Raoul had taught her, at Eli's quiet suggestion. It was not a weapon of fear anymore. It was a tool, a symbol that she would never be helpless again. She was no longer running. She was standing her ground. One evening, as a full, silver moon rose over the valley, they stood on the porch, watching the landscape transform into a world of silver and shadow. The air was cold and clean, and the stars were a brilliant, scattered dust against the blackness. They had just finished the last of the evening chores and were sharing the last of the coffee, their hands wrapped around the warm tin cups. Clara looked out at the valley, this hidden, impossible sanctuary that had saved her. She had come here seeking only a temporary refuge, a place to hide, but it had become so much more. She looked over at the man standing beside her. He was no longer a silhouette of danger, a cold-eyed stranger. He was the architect of her peace, the guardian of her new life. His profile was strong and quiet against the moonlight. The harsh lines of his face softened in the gentle light. He was watching the moon, but she knew he was aware of her, of every breath she took. The love she felt for him was no longer a terrifying secret, but a quiet, powerful certainty, as real and enduring as the stone of the canyons around them. And she knew, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that she could no longer keep it in the silence. The silence had healed them, but now she needed a word, a truth. She turned to face him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He turned to meet her gaze, his gray eyes luminous in the moonlight, waiting. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it held no trace of the fear that had once defined her. It was clear and steady, filled with the simple, profound weight of an undeniable truth. "The first night we met," she began, her gaze holding his. "I only asked to hide under your coat." She saw a flicker of memory in his eyes, a shared image of that desperate, terrified moment in the dark, rattling train car. She took a small breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. "Now," she said, the words a simple, unadorned offering of her entire soul. "Now, I only want to stand by your side for the rest of my life." Her words hung in the moonlit air, as real and tangible as the porch railing beneath her hand. They were a declaration, a confession, and a plea, all woven into a single, fragile thread of hope. She had laid her heart bare, offering him the broken, patched-together thing it had become. And now she stood in the ringing silence, waiting. Eli did not speak. Words were not his currency. He had built his life in the vast, unforgiving silences of the desert, and his soul spoke a different language. He simply stood there, his face a mask of moonlight and shadow, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to reach past her skin and into the very marrow of her bones. He saw not the ragged girl from the train, nor the haunted refugee she had been. He saw the woman standing before him, her spirit as resilient and beautiful as a wildflower growing from stone. He saw the strength she had found, the kindness she showed the boy, the home she had created within the walls of his solitude. He had lived his life as a solitary mesa, weathered and alone, believing that was his nature. But this woman, this Clara, had brought the rain, and now, in the arid landscape of his heart, something green and tenacious was beginning to grow. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took the tin cup from her unresisting fingers, placing it silently on the railing beside his own. Then, his hand, warm and calloused from a life of hard work and harder fights, found hers. He did not snatch it or grab it. He simply enfolded it, his fingers lacing through hers with a gentle, possessive certainty that was more eloquent than any poem. It was an answer. It was an acceptance. It was a promise. He gave her hand a slight, insistent tug, a silent command to follow. He led her off the porch and into the moon-drenched yard. They walked past the quiet barn, past the corral where the horses slept standing, their breath misting in the cool night air. They didn't speak. There was no need. The steady, warm pressure of his hand around hers said everything. It said, "I heard you." It said, "I understand." It said, "Come with me." He led her away from the ranch, along a narrow, winding path that she had never walked before. The path climbed gently, leading them out of the sheltered floor of the valley and onto the broad, open expanse of a high mesa. The moon was so bright it bleached the color from the world, rendering it in luminous shades of silver and charcoal. The silence was immense, a sacred thing, broken only by the soft crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the whisper of the wind through the sparse juniper trees. Clara walked beside him, her heart a quiet, steady drum in her chest. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound and trusting peace. This man, who had once been a terrifying embodiment of the harsh, violent world she was fleeing, had become her anchor, her compass, her safe harbor. His hand, holding hers, was a tether to a life she had never dared to dream of. They reached the far side of the mesa just as the first, faint hint of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon. The sky was turning from a deep, star-dusted indigo to a pale, luminous gray. Eli stopped at the edge of a gentle slope that led down into a small, hidden bowl of land, a secret fold in the earth that was invisible from the valley below. "Wait," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first word either of them had spoken since her declaration. He released her hand, and for a moment, she felt a pang of loss, of being set adrift. But he only moved a few feet away, gathering a few dry sticks and striking a small, quick fire. As the flames licked upwards, he looked at her. "The dawn is cold up here," he said, a simple statement of practical care that was as intimate as a kiss. He took off his heavy duster, the same coat that had once been her desperate, dark sanctuary, and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, and smelled of him of leather and dust and the clean scent of the high desert. She pulled it around herself, the garment an embrace, and sat by the fire as he stood, watching the east. They watched the sunrise together. They saw the sky bleed through 1,000 shades of lavender, rose, and fiery orange. They watched as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the distant mountains, a flood of liquid gold that chased the last of the shadows from the land and set the world ablaze with color and life. And as the full light of morning washed over them, it revealed the secret of the hidden meadow. It was a carpet of wildflowers, a breathtaking, impossible sea of color that filled the small basin from one side to the other. There were fiery splashes of Indian paintbrush, deep, velvety blues of lupine, and cheerful yellow asters, all mingled together in a riot of untamed, natural beauty. The air was alive with the gentle hum of bees and the sweet, clean scent of 1,000 blossoms. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It was a church, built by the hand of God. Eli turned from the sunrise to look at her, his face bathed in the warm morning light. He saw the awe in her eyes, the sheer, unadulterated joy. A rare, true smile touched his own lips, softening the hard lines of his face, making him look younger, more open than she had ever seen him. He held out his hand to her once more. She took it without hesitation, and he led her down into the field. They walked through the flowers, the petals brushing against their legs, releasing fragrant puffs of pollen. He led her to the very center of the meadow and then stopped, turning to face her. The sun was warm on their skin. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue above them, and all around them was a world teeming with vibrant, stubborn life. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, simply looking at each other. There were no vows to be spoken, No ceremony to be performed in this wild, beautiful cathedral. There was only the profound, silent communication of their shared gaze. In his eyes, she saw the vast, lonely landscape of his past, and she saw that she was no longer a stranger in it, but a welcome, vital part of its future. She saw a fierce, protective loyalty and a deep, quiet tenderness that was more precious than all the gold in the world. And in her eyes, he saw the end of his solitude. He saw a warmth and a light that he had never known his life was missing. He saw a strength that matched his own, a spirit that had refused to be broken. He saw his home. She thought back to that first night, to the desperate, whispered question of a girl who had lost everything. And she thought of the woman she was now, who had found a world in the shelter of this man's quiet strength, a single, lingering shadow of her past, a final ghost of the doubt that had haunted her for so long, rose in her mind. She needed to hear it from him, to banish the shadow forever in the bright light of this perfect morning. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, meant for him alone, nearly lost in the gentle hum of the meadow. Is this wrong? It was a question about everything, about her past, about their unconventional beginning, about daring to claim this impossible happiness in a world that had shown her so much cruelty. Eli's gaze never wavered. He lifted her hand, the one he held in his, and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. His voice, when he answered, was as deep and steady and certain as the earth beneath their feet. Only if you stop? A single happy tear traced a path down her cheek. She smiled, a radiant, boundless smile that felt as bright as the sun itself. And in the heart of that wild, secret meadow, surrounded by the vibrant, tenacious life they had both fought so hard to find, they simply stood together, their future stretching out before them, as open and full of promise as the western sky. And they didn't stop, never again. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.